Council meeting of 17 and 18 October. European Council and Commission statements. Before we open up the discussions, can I tell you that in accordance with the Catch the Eye procedure, there'll be standard registration for the blue card and the new system allowing you to register electronically, so keep your voting card with you. As well as that instruction, could I suggest that you register for Catch the Eye as soon as possible rather than leaving it until later. That said, I shall give the floor to Council President, Mr. Tusk. Donald, you have the floor.
Grazie, Presidente. Grazie, David. President Sassoli, members of the European Parliament, please allow me to present my last report from the European Council. Let us focus on three matters. Firstly, the European Council condemned Turkey's unilateral military action in north-east Syria. No one is fooled by the so-called ceasefire. Turkey needs to end its military action permanently, withdraw its forces, and respect international humanitarian law. Any other course means unacceptable human suffering, a victory for Daesh, and a serious threat to European security. The European Council also reconfirmed its full solidarity with Cyprus, faced with Turkey's illegal drillings off its coast. When it comes to Brexit, the European Council endorsed the deal reached by our negotiator and Prime Minister Johnson's government. As you know, it is based on the deal that we agreed with the previous government. The changes concern the Protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland, formerly known as the backstop. Prime Minister Johnson's acceptance to have customs checks at the points of entry into Northern Ireland will allow us to avoid border checks between Ireland and Northern Ireland and will ensure the integrity of the single market. The revised deal was possible and acceptable to the EU because, firstly, it had the support of Ireland, secondly, it had the support of the European Commission, ensuring that all our negotiating objectives were met, and thirdly, because it avoids a chaotic no-deal Brexit. On the Council side, we have just finalised the necessary steps for the EU's approval, and the legal texts are now with you. The European Parliament has a role to play, and it is an important one. The situation is quite complex following events over the weekend in the UK, and the British request for an extension of the Article 50 process. I am consulting the leaders on how to react and will decide in the coming days. It is obvious that the result of these consultations will very much depend on what the British Parliament decides or doesn't decide. We should be ready for every scenario. But one thing must be clear. As I said to Prime Minister Johnson on Saturday, a no-deal Brexit will never be our decision. Finally, the leaders held a difficult debate on enlargement. Following the clear recommendation by the Commission, an overwhelming majority of Member States wanted to open accession talks with North Macedonia and Albania. Despite this, the required unanimity was not possible last week. In my opinion, this was a mistake, which I have said to the leaders, and I was a bit more direct then. Now I can only hope that the leaders draw the right conclusions when they discuss the accession process before the Zagreb summit in May 2020. Together with President-elect von der Leyen, the leaders also discussed the future of the European Union in terms of its strategic agenda, the future EU budget and the incoming Commission's priorities. We are determined that the EU leads the way in fighting the climate crisis. A socially just transition to a green economy is not only a necessity, but it is an opportunity to improve our environment while creating jobs. As this is my last appearance here with Jean-Claude Juncker, I would like to express my greatest appreciation for him and his work. These were difficult 5 years for the Union, but we have always cooperated in good faith. Our respective roles and different perspectives sometimes meant political disagreements, but I can say without hesitation that Jean-Claude has always been devoted to Europe and served Europe well. And I am honored to call you my friend. Thank you, Jean-Claude. I also want to thank the European Parliament for 5 years of good cooperation. It doesn't mean that we have always agreed. Quite the contrary. But I have always respected you, knowing that we share the same goal, to protect our Union and our people. Thank you very much.
Grazie, Presidente Tusk.
Thank you, President Tusk. And I'll now give the floor to the President of the Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker. President.
Mille grazie, Signor Presidente, Mr. President of the European Council, dear colleagues. It was an emotional moment for me last week when I attended my last European Council together with my good friend Donald. We are today debating the 147th European Council of my political career. 147 or 148, I don't know exactly. And it is today the 105th time that I speak to you in this plenary, the beating heart of European democracy. In many of these 105 debates, I had to discuss the UK's departure from the European Union with you. In truth, it has pained me to spend so much of this mandate dealing with Brexit, when I have thought of nothing less than how this union could do better for its citizens. Waste of time and waste of energy. The Commission has worked tirelessly to negotiate and renegotiate an agreement with the United Kingdom, to respect the UK's decision to leave the European Union. We now have a new agreement, which again creates the legal certainty for an ordinary withdrawal of the UK from the European Union. It took a huge amount of work to arrive at this point. I listened to Prime Minister Johnson in the same way as I listened to Prime Minister May. Our negotiators, mainly Michel Barnier, have once again worked around the clock, and once again they have shown creativity and determination. The agreement we reached with the United Kingdom's government addresses this Parliament's demands, all the Parliament's demands. I will always regret the United Kingdom's decision to leave the Union, but at least we can look ourselves in the eye and say that we have done all in our power to make sure that this departure is orderly. And in this same spirit, we have done everything in our power to prepare the European Union for all eventualities, irrespective of what is happening on the other side of the Channel. We need now to watch events in Westminster very closely. But it's not possible, not imaginable, that this Parliament would ratify the agreement before Westminster will have ratified the agreement. First London, then Brussels and Strasbourg.
Mr. President, We have been dealing with the financial framework for the next 7 years in great detail alongside the European Council. And I would like it to be minuted that my view is that time is of the essence. Time is running out if we're going to reach agreement in Council and later elsewhere. If we lose any more time, then we will get into financial difficulties in the first 2 years of the financial framework. The important thing, however, is that Member States and other actors be aware of what the financial framework for the next 7 years is. Young Erasmus students, researchers, and many others do need to know this, and it is important for the success of the European project to get to grips with this, and we mustn't let it fail because we cannot reach agreement. The budget volume proposed by the European Commission, I have to say, is a minimum. It's a minimum. And the proposals that are currently on the table, the most recent proposals by the Finnish presidency, are not acceptable. You cannot shape Europe with 1% of GDP.
Monsieur le Président, nous avons...
In French, we are going to be talking about enlargement, Mr. President, and I am very disappointed by the decision, or lack thereof, by the European Council. North Macedonia and Albania had a right for the negotiations with these countries to be started, and it was a huge mistake not to have opened the negotiations with these two countries. It's a grave error because it affects two countries in their hearts, and it does create the impression that when you make promises you don't keep them, and nobody will respect us throughout the world if we do that.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President Juncker. We'll now hear from the group heads. Mr. Weber first.
Ich möchte zunächst mich bei Donald Tusk.
President, can I begin by thanking Donald Tusk for his 5 years of work for this common house of Europe. He kept the European Council together. He held the ring in difficult times, and as you've said, we all stand for the same idea. And in this House, it's perhaps easier to defend that common line than in your body, at your level, in European Council. So thanks for your work on behalf of the entire EPP group. Colleagues, the last European Council on Turkey did not take the decision we wanted. The invasion against international law in Syria. Kurds were our partners in the fight against Islamic terror. More than 11,000 Kurds laid down their lives. ISIS fighters are in the camps. It's not clear whether they're going to be released. And it's a pity that the Council could not take more robust measures because we had the illegal occupation of Cyprus, restriction of press freedoms, threats against migrants, the invasion of Syria with the illegal invasion. And where's the clear signal from Europe? Where's the clear signal we are sending out of condemnation? We have our discussions, and in Council we talk about our dismay, but dismay is not enough in these difficult times. We take the view that as long as Turkey is aggressive, an aggressor, we have got to draw the economic consequences. It cannot be that long-term Turkey benefits from the customs union, from the European internal market, and at the same time is an aggressor elsewhere. The second thing is the MFF. Our future finances, the Finnish proposal, is a real provocation for the European Parliament. Jean-Claude Juncker said it's not sufficient, it's not up to the job of funding our future challenges. And I believe that we've got a role to play. Council should not take the risk of having it founder when it comes to the European Parliament. We need to have the wherewithal rise to those challenges with the fresh money that we require. And the budget 2020, which we'll be debating this week, is a sneak preview in future for research, youth, Erasmus. We can't have cuts because we, the EPP, will not be supporting that line. And we've made a historic mistake. The Council made a historic blunder. North Macedonia and Albania are not given the accession perspective that they deserve. There is instability in the Balkans. We could have brought a dose of stability, and we have a responsibility so to do. And last week I think this was a major blunder on the part of the European Summit when they were asked this historic question. We've asked much of those countries. North Macedonia had to actually change its name to get its accession perspective. They strove to do just that, and now the door is slammed in their face, and we are losing credibility, and that is serious, and the Council and the Member States bear that responsibility. Colleagues, I'm happy for us to examine these structures and say, can we manage enlargement processes differently in future? But we should have told North Macedonia that before, we should have told the Albanians that before, and Council was silent. And I think that we are merging things which are not directly connected. And there is a party political dimension to this. EPP representatives in the European Council, all to a man, gave their support to the enlargement perspectives of North Macedonia, and that was Emmanuel Macron and Mark Rutte, where there was clear opposition to those two countries. And we have got to undo that and give that perspective to those two countries.
So this week we can simply say, let's wait and let's have a cup of coffee for what will happen in the next hours in London. Coffee, yeah, tea, you're right. Sorry for this. It's also more a European perspective. It is positive that we have a compromise, that Michel and the negotiator in London and finally Johnson and Jean-Claude Juncker found a compromise. No hard border, but on the other hand, no backstop. So I think for both sides, it's a good compromise. Now the procedure is in our hand. The House of Commons, the upper house, the Lords will decide, and then we have finally to see the outcome, whether the amendments will be accepted or not. So we are still in the hand of London. We are waiting for London. And for us as European Parliament, I would say, we have the same right to do a proper assessment about the text which is on our table. There is no need to rush. There is no need to hurry up. We have the same rights to discuss it on AFCO level and then finally here in the plenary after the discussions on the group level. So that's why I see no chance that this week we will have any kind of decision. So the European Parliament is the last, let me say, institution who has to make the final assessment, and that is not only a technical assessment. We do a political assessment on the treaty, but the last days gave us the opportunity that we finally manage a good development on Brexit in this negative case of the Brexit, and a good chance that we keep friendship between Europe and Great Britain to look for a good development also in the future. Thank you so much.
Grazie.
Thank you. Chair of the EPP, I shall now give the floor to Chair Garcia Perez. Thank you, President, Mr. Tusk. I would also like to take this opportunity to express my group's gratitude to you. Of course, we've had many disagreements between Council and Parliament, but we should also recognise the significant efforts which you have made personally to try to achieve our common objectives. President, fellow members, this European Council was particularly relevant because of current affairs. Obviously, we have our eyes on Brexit and the new term of office, which will be vital, and we need to decide on our budget. Brexit is proving to be a difficult and painful process. As Social Democrats, we've always wanted the UK to stay in the EU. Each step which is taken has its own significance, and that is also the case in relation to Saturday's adoption of an amendment in Westminster preventing a no-deal exit, and the House of Commons now needs to continue with its procedure and give a view on the agreement. It is only at that point, when we are aware of the decision of the UK's Parliament, it is only at that point that this European Parliament will then act accordingly and meet its responsibilities. And I would like to thank Michel Barnier and the EU27 for showing unity, strength through unity, being consistent, speaking with one voice. Council has done that during the Brexit negotiations, and it should do the same now as we decide on the direction that the EU should take over the next 5 years. If we wish to be credible, we need to put our money where our mouth is. In the last European elections, the citizens of Europe asked for a new Europe, a greener Europe with a more robust defence of rule of law, with greater commitments to social rights, equality and transparency in decision-making. For that reason, we would like the European Council to show greater leadership and commitment to meeting the challenges which we currently face. In spring, the European Commission said we'd be climate neutral by 2050. Unfortunately, that is a proposal which has not yet received unanimous support from heads of state and government. Nonetheless, as Social Democrats, we have achieved putting the new Green Deal at the heart of the future Commission's priorities. But it will only work if all the necessary resources are put on the table. We won't accept it being workers, small businesses or families having to foot the bill for the environmental transition. We need to ensure that there is fair financing for that transition, and that is only possible with a reasonable multi-annual financial framework. We set our objectives in November 2018, but since then we've just been waiting for Council. We stand by our position. We will only support a budget with new own resources reflecting the EU's priorities. Only in that way will we be able to give impetus to new instruments without reducing funding for current policies which are vital to the EU: agriculture, cohesion, fisheries. We need to ensure that we have sufficient resources to meet new challenges, migration, external action, defence, whilst also dealing with the economic difficulties that many citizens face. We have now got, as part of the new Commission's priorities, measures on unemployment, youth poverty, and we can only achieve these aims, including the environmental ones, if we are ambitious, if Europe grows. So for that reason, we will not accept anything below 1.3% of GDP. That's what we need for moving forward. Otherwise, Member States will be responsible for the Commission not being able to meet its aims. We ask our neighbours to bring in reforms and then leave them waiting once they've actually achieved the reforms. We support opening accession negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania. Of course, there's a long way to go, and negotiations may be a long path, but this will also breathe new life into the EU. Bringing in the Western Balkan family will not only contribute to stability in the region, it will also contribute to stability for the EU at large. We would also like to be more ambitious on the international stage. We support Council's condemnation of Turkey's behaviour, although we lament the fact that there is no tangible action being taken. And I would also like to take this opportunity to express my solidarity and support for Cyprus. We will not let Turkey continuing to illegally enter the territory which it should respect. We need to be ambitious. We need to all work together, and the European Parliament will meet the challenges. I hope Council is aware of the significant responsibility which it currently has.
Cholos.
Thank you. And Mr. Cholos, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Président, tout d'abord,
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Donald, at the end of your mandate, I'd just like to say that I was able to work with you in the Commission, the Council, and now the European Parliament. And I would like to say that I've always appreciated your many qualities, your ideas of Europe, and the way in which you pushed European unity ahead as the first President of the Council from Eastern Europe. And I'd like to thank you for what you've done for Europe. As far as the Council conclusions are concerned on Brexit, we've got a bit used to this, we keep seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, but now our British friends keep coming up with imaginative solutions to extend things and keep the final decision waiting. The British press has continued to criticise the European institutions for their excess of creativity, but we see that they're capable of doing the same. So much the better, then. It's a good cause. As far as the Parliament is concerned, we're delighted that we now do have an agreement, and I'd like once again to thank Michel Barnier and his team for all the work they've done. It's critical that there should be an exit of the United Kingdom with an agreement, and we now expect the Westminster Parliament to finish its work, and clearly we cannot take a decision in the European Parliament until we have the final decision and ratification of the agreement in the British Parliament. We've taken our responsibilities, and as Manfred has said, it's not the European Parliament that should be put under pressure to do its work, and no doubt it cannot be done this week. As for the other points that were mentioned in Council, there are just two of them I'd like to pick up on: the budget and then the enlargement process. On the budget, our group participated in the drafting of the European Parliament resolution calling clearly for ambition for Europe to be reflected in the budget, and the Parliament will live up to its responsibilities not only when it asks for a strong budget, but also in showing that Europe isn't just built with negotiations based around numbers. Europe is built with ambition, and the budget cannot simply be a splitting up of financial contributions of member states. We must now, if we have a European ambition, work seriously on own resources and demonstrate that Europe can construct itself a proper European budget. When it comes to enlargement, I'd just like to say that as a Romanian citizen, coming from a country that has received so many benefits from the enlargement process, that I am persuaded that enlargement must stay at the heart of European politics. We cannot imagine a strong Europe without it being an open Europe for our neighbours, and particularly for those that believe in Europe even now, and perhaps stronger than some of the countries that are in the EU. So we must keep the doors of the European Union open. Europe must remain a powerful motor for democratic reform. We cannot ask these countries to carry out reforms without then giving them a clear ambition and a clear notion or prospect for Europe. And I certainly understand the concerns and the desire for the European project to be completed around its current perimeter, and it is therefore why we support a future conference on the future of Europe. But it is only with ambition that we will be able to continue the enlargement process, so our doors must clearly remain open. Thank you.
Grazie, Presidente Lambert.
Thank you, Chairman Lambert.
This gives me a feeling of déjà vu. So even the Brits use French to describe this situation. We've been here before. That was in November 2018. We had a European Council celebrating an agreement with the then British Prime Minister. We know what the British Parliament has done with that agreement, or failed to do with that agreement. So we are back at the same place with a variant of that agreement. Now everything is in the hands of the House of Commons and House of Lords. The British Parliament must make up its mind. Either it ratifies, and I insist, it ratifies, not expresses broad agreement, it ratifies this agreement, and then indeed our Parliament will do its job. And I cannot imagine, Mr. President of the Council, that the Council will not allow this Parliament to have the time needed to complete the ratification. I know that the heads of state and government have a lot of respect indeed for this Parliament. Even if we have frictions, sometimes I know that there's mutual respect, and I want to keep it that way. Now, it can also be that the British Parliament refuses to ratify this agreement. And in that case, I would just say one thing. If you are unable or unwilling to do it, dear colleagues of the British Parliament, then you must have the guts to put either this agreement or the agreement concluded between the European Union and Theresa May to a popular vote and let the people decide. And I would say that actually this is the only certain way to get to a decision, because we know that either way we will have a British choice and we will respect this choice. We will fight for the United Kingdom to remain, but if a majority accepts the agreement, we will respect that and part ways in a friendly way. Now, je voudrais dire quelques mots.
And now just a few words in French on enlargement. For us, it is clear that the Western Balkans have a vocation of joining the European Union. It's in the interest of no one, neither the citizens of those countries nor the citizens of the European Union, to leave those countries in the lurch, because we know that's the best way for them to slip away from democracy and the rule of law. They have a vocation to join, and that is beyond discussion. The decision taken by the Council, and I'm glad to have heard you, Mr. Tusk and Mr. Juncker, say this yourselves, the refusal to respect our commitments, because this was our word, opening negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania, is a blunder, a serious blunder, a major blunder on the part of the European Council, which needs unanimity. We know that. We know that a majority of the Council wanted to go forward, but as Manfred Weber has said this morning, it was particularly two heads of state and government who took the decision to block all of that. Now, I stress that it's simply opening negotiations, not concluding them, and all the arguments about we've got to deepen first is completely fallacious, because we know that those negotiations are going to last a long time. We would do justice, take the time, provided that there is a political desire so to do. And in the course of the years, if you remember Emmanuel Macron, we welcomed the great European. Time goes by and we realise perhaps he's not as great, nor perhaps as European either. Thank you.
Presidente Bay, prego, a lei la parola.
President Bay.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Turkey hogged the debate in the European Council, and that's been the case for 45 years, with Cyprus not being defended against constant aggression from Turkey and illegal occupation of Cypriot waters has been taking place, with military action taking place illegally in violation of international law in northern Syria over the last few weeks, which has led to jihadi groups, Daesh and al-Nusra, being strengthened. Over the last few years, we've seen 100 billion euros going on migration policy, where in fact Turkey is not managing migratory flows and just increasing blackmail and threats against EU countries, saying they will remove the barricades and let migrants in. We've had 9 billion euros spent on pre-accession, and rather than a temporary suspension of the accession process, we should definitively cease that process, accession process. Turkey is not European culturally, historically, and it's defending interests that run completely counter to the interests of the nations of Europe. The discussion in Council also addressed the multi-annual financial framework. Of course, they talked about own resources and tax, carbon taxes, plastic taxes. Taxes are going up, they always do, and the excuse this time is the environment. But what consistency is there if we're having agreements, free trade agreements, customs agreements with countries that do not respect our environmental standards, How can we then add an extra layer of taxation to our own people that will be a burden against European countries and will hit our compatriots' spending power, hit them in the pocket? So, pay more, get less has become the motto. 100 billion euros being spent by France over the last 2 decades, and we now see CAP payments going down, which will be a big hit for French farming. French farmers committing suicide 1 every 2 days. We need to find less costly forms of cooperation. There are instruments available. We don't need to keep forcing people's hand in terms of integration and globalized free trade.
Thank you, Mr. Van Orden.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, we called for the EU to show goodwill and flexibility in its approach to Brexit. We've now seen this in the most recent negotiations and at the European Council. What a change in atmosphere. My thanks to Michel Barnier, my thanks to Donald Tusk, my thanks to Jean-Claude Juncker. And I hope there will be some proper reflection in due course on why the British people chose to leave the European Union. And I hope that before December 2020 there will be technical alternatives, acceptable technical alternatives to customs checks. Ladies and gentlemen, the Presidents and Prime Ministers of the Member States in Council have now agreed a deal and want to get on with it. They want the urgent consent of this House, and we should deliver this with all speed. After all, the departure date of the 31st of October was set not by the British government, but by the European Council back in April. There is no appetite for extension. Some colleagues say they want to see how the British Parliament is responding, but I would say our task is separate. We should not be distracted. I'm sure no one here, not even Mr. Verhofstadt, wishes to take on a role as the Bercow of Brussels. In any case, the withdrawal agreement is being put to the House of Commons today. When it passes, I trust this will provide the signal that some here are looking for. Some shenanigans may follow, but it's not our task to join in. This is our moment to rise above the squabbling, all the alternative political agendas, and show that the European Parliament can be decisive when it matters. And the EU must not make another sequencing mistake. Let's get Brexit done without delay. Thank you.
Grazie, Presidente Schirdewan.
Thank you, President Schirdewan. Yes, thank you, President. The results of the Council last week leave many questions open and also have not contributed to solve many of our problems. In fact, in many areas, they've worsened the status quo ante. The whole question of North Macedonia and Albania in Council, their decision caused a government crisis in North Macedonia. And we're supposed to be getting closer to our climate objectives, and obviously some of the heads of state and government find that a mountain to climb. I'm glad that Council shares the political assessment of my group in that the military intervention of Turkey in North Syria and the war against the Kurds, again, is not covered by international law. It's illegal in international law. Now, if the Commission and Council have the same assessment, why don't they support our political demands, which have been set out across the political spectrum, surprisingly to me? Immediate end to arms sales to exports to Turkey, and recognition of Kurdish self-determination. This pressure by Turkey. We've got to defend the democratic opposition and also the Kurdish men and women. Now on Brexit, my group in past years has been constructive in its contribution to solving the crisis, and we will not stop. We will continue. Our priority over that period has always been to secure the and underpin peace in Northern Ireland, and defend citizens' rights. Now there's a deal which is going to have a stormy ride through the House of Commons. We want to get the ratified text in front of us from London. And once we get there, if we get there, we will need to address this debate in the time we have. And I can assure you that our group will go through that process. If we don't get a text from London, that's possible. That's a possibility in the next few days. Then the forthcoming decision on extension will be on the table. And I believe that the British people need to be able to answer a question again. Many problems will fall into place in that eventuality. Mr. Tusk, despite all the content problems we have had and disagreements, can I congratulate you on all your efforts and on the results?
Yeah.
Mr. Gyungyoshi.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would just like to confine my brief intervention to the subject of Brexit, something which we are trying to come to terms with for the last 3 years since we know the result of the referendum. Let's be clear, the result must be respected regardless of the small margin. The UK must leave and bear all the consequences of its decision. I think Mr. Juncker was correct when he said that no extension should be granted. Regardless of whether there is an agreement or no agreement, the UK should leave. And I think also this is in the best interest of Europe to let the UK go. The decision that the British people have made 3 years ago was not an enormous surprise. British Euroscepticism has a very long tradition. Since Henry VIII, I think this is at the heart of British geopolitical thinking. And since this is a 500-year tradition, I respect it. But Europe and the European Union must also be very clear about the challenges it is facing and must be very clear about its priorities. Europe must face migration, wage inequalities, economic disparities, climate change, and it must come up with a solution. And if Europe wants to be successful, then it has to get rid of all the obstacles, end the post-Brexit fatigue, be very clear about terms and conditions when it comes to new candidate member states, and also it must be very clear with internal or external saboteurs who are trying to slow the process. So as far as the UK is concerned, the decision to divorce was taken. It is time to move on for all. Thank you.
I now give the floor to Madam Hübner for 2 minutes.
President Tusk, President Juncker, dear Donald, dear Jean-Claude, thank you indeed for your commitment to Europe and especially for your comments regarding enlargement today. I will speak on Brexit, and during the coming days the task of our House will be to evaluate the withdrawal agreement and work on our consent to it. We will have to cope with unpredictable outcomes of complex process of voting in the British Parliament, but it is clear that we will only give consent once the process of ratification in the UK has been finalised. This all has indeed a sense of déjà vu, as we do not know today what majorities will emerge during various votes in the House of Commons and what final result they might produce. And in particular, it is difficult to judge today what can come out of the vote on the timetable motion. It is regrettable indeed that once again we have to cope with a huge dose of uncertainty at this stage of this long journey. My hope is that, unlike the 2 extensions, the second of which is now coming to an end, the transition period which an orderly withdrawal will offer will be efficiently used to give us, as future close partners, the best possible agreement on unprecedentedly close future relationship. Let me finish by underlining that negative coverage of EU citizens' rights in media, confusing announcements on freedom of movement, use of a secondary level legislation, also what we learned during our hearings with citizens, all that signals a risk that those rights might be not respected in the future. We should remember, therefore, that EU citizens' rights in the UK are set out in the withdrawal agreement, which will be subject to the formal ratification. Thank you.
Thank you. Now for 2 minutes, Mr. Silva Pereira.
Thank you, Chair. The European Council reached a new withdrawal agreement with the UK government, and that is in itself a good thing. It proves beyond any reasonable doubt that the EU is not here to make life difficult to the UK. In fact, we were able to negotiate agreements with 3 different Prime Ministers in the UK, Mr Cameron, Mrs May, and now Mrs Boris Johnson. And of course, an agreement will allow us to promote an orderly Brexit and avoid the risk of a catastrophic no deal. But we also know that until today, the UK Parliament has not taken any decision whatsoever on this proposed deal. Now, the position of this Parliament and the position of our group is completely clear. We will not proceed with any consent vote until the UK Parliament has approved the agreement. And now let me be completely clear. First, any consent vote means not only the final consent by the plenary, but also any consent vote in our Constitutional Affairs Committee. And when we say approval by the UK Parliament, we mean the UK Parliament with 2 chambers, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And when we say the agreement has to be approved, we mean the final ratification in the UK Parliament after all amendments have been considered, including the one that is asking for a final say of the people in a second referendum. The European Parliament will be ready as soon as the UK Parliament is ready. And if an extension becomes needed, the position of this Parliament was already stated and it's clear. We will support such an extension. And we do support the most important political statement made here today by President Tusk, that our decision will never be no deal. If so, the Council will have for sure the support of our political group, but also indeed the support of this Parliament. Thank you.
Now for 2.5 minutes, Mr Verhofstadt.
First of all, I want to say to Mr Van Orden that I'm honoured that you compared me with Mr Bercow. It's in any way better than to be compared with Rees-Mogg, because Bercow's ties are more colourful. I like them more than those of Mr Rees-Mogg. So that first of all. I want to thank the Conference of Presidents that they have confirmed that the consent procedure in this House will only start after the full ratification by the side of the United Kingdom, and that's important. That was in our resolutions. And I think, dear colleagues, we need to use the time between now and the consent vote to solve the last problems that still exist today with the rights of the EU citizens that are living in the UK. And there are still a number of problems to be solved. There is the vulnerable citizens, 200,000 of them, who are in need of assistance. There is those who will miss the deadline, and there one of the members of the UK government has said, oh, we're going to do deportation. Well, I can tell you this problem needs to be solved in all clarity before that there is no deportation of these people. 3, there is the difference. There is a difference between a settled status and pre-settled status. What is, in my opinion, not always clear, why people are in pre-settled status and not in the settled status with full rights. And there is the independent monitoring authority. It's not clear in the withdrawal bill how independent the independent monitoring authority will be. And we have to be sure that it is a real independent monitoring authority. So before the House will give consent, I want to see these problems solved, dear colleagues. We don't want that the EU citizens become victims in another Windrush scandal in Britain. That cannot happen. Finally, I want to use this intervention also to say some positive things about Jean-Claude Juncker, but he is also already is not there, and especially to Donald Tusk, thank him for the cooperation. We had never words with each other during these 5 years in the debates, and I want to
wish him all the luck in his upcoming challenges, somewhere in a big country in the east of Europe. Good luck, Donald.
Thank you. For 1.5 minutes, Mr. Smith.
President, thank you, colleagues. I'll also limit my remarks to Brexit, unsurprisingly. But President Tusk, I would, from Scotland, very warmly thank you and praise you for your conduct in office and for your efforts to keep the door open to us. It has been appreciated in Scotland, it's been appreciated across the UK as well. You've been a true friend to the United Kingdom. Thank you. Dziękuję bardzo. The last time we met, colleagues, to discuss this, I alleged bad faith on the part of those close to the UK government, not their front spokespeople or apologists, but their tormentors, people of bad faith who around this UK government are looking to trash whatever deal you have agreed in good faith. I didn't expect to be proven right as quickly as I have been. Even overnight we saw very worrying moves that a delegated legislation committee stuffed with government MPs has approved ending the rights of residents of EU nationals in the UK, self-employed and business owners. EU nationals were told in the advance of the referendum nothing would change. It's changing now, before the text has even been ratified. So what to do? You must deal with the interlocutors you're dealt. I respect that. But I tell you frankly, it may not have escaped your notice, but the UK is in chaos right now. Mr Johnson's government hangs by a thread. Its word cannot be trusted, even if there was good faith and an intent to implement it. Also, that the UK is not Westminster. I'd refer you to a letter from the joint First Minister of Scotland and of Wales. The Scottish and Welsh Parliaments must also consent to this. We have not consented to this. Let's be real, colleagues. There is no possible way that Westminster can conclude proper ratification of this deal this week. We should not lend the credibility of this Parliament or the Council to collude in that shabby deception. The only answer, colleagues, is more time. Time is the great healer. An extension has been requested, albeit through gritted teeth, by a Prime Minister who's desperate to pretend he hasn't, but an extension has been requested. Grant it. Grant it now. Grant it for a year, longer. Mr Johnson and his fellow travellers may have wasted the time. We will not. We are trying to find solutions. We need more time to do that. Thank you.
And I'm afraid, Alan, you used more time than you had. So I'm being patient because there is sufficient time. But I would ask colleagues to try and make your key point at the beginning and build on it. For 1 minute now, Mr Moyton.
President Tusk, President Juncker, we are watching a farce in seemingly never-ending acts. The Brits decided in a majority vote to leave the EU, a referendum, a majority, a clear decision. But so far, no result, no exit. Which of you would actually still trust yourselves to explain to the people how you would betray and block the withdrawal agreement? You've been extremely successful in making the withdrawal agreement as unattractive as possible, and against all expectations, Boris Johnson does now have a majority for ratification. And yet, in the European Parliament, you're dragging out the ratification. And the adjutant of the EU at Westminster, John Bercow, is doing his bit by preventing the Commons from voting on the exit agreement. Everybody is there, sitting in their seats. It's a strange piece of theatre. On the one hand, I cry, and on the other hand, I laugh. I cry because we are witnesses to the perversion of democratic processes. I laugh because I know that the boys and girls of the Brexit Party are here, continuing to enrich the freedom of this House and continuing to get on your collectivistic nerves. That, at least, is gratifying.
Mr Moyton, will you accept a blue card from Mr Ansip? No, not. It wasn't a blue card. I take all that back. It was a. So you don't want a blue card? Okay. In that case, we will move immediately to Mr Epping for 1 minute.
Dank u wel, mevrouw de voorzitter.
Thank you, President. The European Council couldn't agree on starting accession negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania, and just as well. Thank goodness, thanks to France. no accession for the time being. Of course, the idea of the Brits leaving and the Balkans joining is no good transaction, and not certainly for Albania with all the corruption. It's on the same level as Colombia and Panama. Look at Romania in 2007. Everyone thought Romania was ready for accession ready. Corruption was a problem. They joined. Money flowed to Romania, and corruption continued. One political crisis after the other. It's a bridge too far. Since 2004, the Commission in Turkey has fed the monster named Erdogan. There were those. France has blocked everything with regard to North Macedonia, and I don't always agree with him, but this time I have to say, La France, merci.
For 1 minute, Ms. Anderson. Micro.
Okay. So we hope we have afforded a no deal, but it's still Brexit for the north of Ireland. It's a messy and ugly compromise, and if the British mess further and ultimately give a unionist consent veto, there will never, ever again be a Stormont Assembly. This deal, as agreed, mitigates the worst damage of Brexit. It avoids a harder border in Ireland, it avoids custom posts, and we have a common EU VAT regime, a special status of sorts. Now that's important. But cows and sheep get EU standards, whereas people get potentially lower British standards on workers' rights, consumer rights, environmental protection, no level playing field. Now that's damaging. We're allowed to hang around the EU house, but it's still only a halfway house. People want the real thing. Irish unity is the agreed way forward for the people back into the EU. This House should recognise that. This House should act to facilitate that. And this House should plan and prepare for Irish unity and not be asleep at the wheel.
For 1 minute, Ms. Harris. It's straight in front of you, the button.
MPs in my parliament are stopping a deal which is mandated by the people, a no deal which is mandated by the people, and a general election. Parliament does not have a democratic mandate for a second referendum or cancelling Brexit, and yet they are amending their way to it. Control has been stolen from my people. But we do not give up. Despite it all, the majority of Brits still wouldn't want to change the Brexit result. So I would like to celebrate millions of voters who stood up for what they believed in 2016 and still have the courage not to give up. They show the best of British through their perseverance in the face of adversity. You may have tried to wear us down, dampened our spirits through the emotional rollercoaster of our negotiations, but my belief in them is unwavering and resolute. They will be heard.
Can I... Sorry, Ms. Harris. Ms. Harris. Hello, Ms. Harris. The speaker is trying to communicate with you. Thank you. Would you accept a blue card request from Madam Grappini?
Always like a debate.
Madam Grappini.
Mulțumesc, doamna președintă. Stimată colegă, în...
Thank you, Madam President. Dear colleague, in your report, you provided us with information saying a majority of citizens in the UK did not want to change the result of the referendum. Can I just ask where you got that one, where you got that? It's not something I had heard about, and I have been seeing the protests in the street, which suggests differently. you have to be rigorous as an MEP.
To mention the 54% Comres poll that was released last week, I'd also like to mention the 17.4 million people who shall not be forgotten in their vote in 2016 that still remain a majority.
So, again, Ms. Voarden would also like to ask you a question. Just wait. No, you don't have to answer before she asks. Madam, you have the floor.
I'd just like to remind you that your slogan in 2016 was "Take back control," and that's what our Parliament's doing. Isn't that what you wanted? In my country, the people are sovereign. I'm not sure too much about this Parliament, but in my country, people make the laws. I want the people to decide. And our slogan didn't exist in 2016. The Brexit Party is very new.
Could we now, for 1.5 minutes, Madam Giori.
You got two. Lucy, yeah, baby. Best part of the More enjoyable.
Madam Giori.
Thank you, Madam President. Tisztelt képviselőtársaim, sajnos egyes tagállami vezetők.
Unfortunately, some member states' leaders lacked courage, wisdom and ability to think long-term at last week's European Council. As a result, it has not been decided that the European Union will finally open accession negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania. As the four Visegrad heads of state said before the summit, the decision will affect our credibility in the region and could have serious long-term consequences for our stability and security. It is time for us to act in a geopolitical manner. It is not in our own interest to keep our friends waiting, to keep these two countries waiting. We should acknowledge the work that they have done. We can't keep moving the goalposts. And let us not be naive about this. There will be others, strong long-term competitors, who will want to occupy this vacuum that the EU is leaving. They're already there. You just have to open your eyes to see them. A final point. It's strange how we measure how European people are in the EU. If something happens in a far-flung country that runs counter to our values, we have to speak with one voice. That is the European thing. But when you have a serious disappointment for citizens of two European countries in this way, you don't hear comments saying that the blockers were not truly European.
Thank you. Last week, the European Council adopted the revised withdrawal agreement as well as the political declaration. And on the EU side, everything has been done, everything to ensure that an agreement could be got together that would avoid a crashing out. And I would like to thank the chief negotiator for the EU, Michel Barnier, for having done excellent work. It has been possible to keep unity and the Parliament's desiderata, and the fact that the UK is leaving the EU is one that worries us, and although we have respect for the public will in the UK, there are those Brits who are fighting for a new referendum, and there is a heavy responsibility which now is incumbent on the UK, on Boris Johnson. But I would expect the UK Parliament to find a way through this. Thank you.
1 minute, Madam Porritt.
I want to thank our European friends for their continued patience on Brexit. But let's not be fooled. This deal is a ticking time bomb. If it passes both the UK and European Parliaments, in little over a year from now, we may be looking at a situation akin to no deal.
There is a risk of divergence on everything from workers' rights to environmental standards to taxation, due to the decision to scrap the level playing field from the withdrawal agreement and place that in the political declaration. The EU would walk away from free trade negotiations if there is too much divergence, and it is unrealistic to think that such negotiations could conclude in only a year. This is a task set up to fail by a British Prime Minister who won't need to clear up the mess, because he'll probably be removed from power in a general election soon. His self-imposed deadline should not dictate the futures and freedoms of young people, our fellow Europeans in the UK and Brits living elsewhere in the EU. President Tusk has acknowledged receipt of the letter requesting an extension. We need that extension to be granted. We must have a people's vote.
One minute now for Madam Phillips.
Thank you. On Saturday, I marched with 1 million others in London calling for a people's vote. I marched because leaving the EU through the British government's rotten deal poses a threat to our country. It weakens workers' rights, it slashes and burns environmental rules, and it will hold back people whose communities have already suffered generations of governments abandoning them. This deal will harm every part of the UK, but it won't hit us all evenly. Women will suffer first, people of colour will endure the worst consequences, and those with the least now will have even less. That's why we need a people's vote, so that people can have a final choice between this specific deal and Remain. Democracy did not die on the 23rd of June 2016, and there is no majority in our country for a dangerous deal. And so while all eyes in the UK are currently on Westminster, I want to say something loud and clear here in Strasbourg. I will not give up on workers, on our environment, or those likely to be worst affected by this dangerous deal. I will not give up on Britain remaining in the EU. Thank you.
I think we have 2 blue cards. Well, we won't have 4 blue cards, that's for sure. We might take 2. So the first one, if you accept, madam, you don't have to, but it's your choice. Do you accept the blue cards?
Yes.
Mr. Habib.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Ms Phillips describes the reduction in standards which would ensue in the event of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. Does she have no belief, self-confidence and understanding of the great British values that we have instilled across the globe for the betterment of mankind and indeed the freedom of the continent in which we now sit?
Could we hear the answer, please?
Madam Chair, I do not understand why those people there are so afraid of democracy and putting back to the people something specific that they can vote on will not affect just their futures but the whole of a continent. Thank you.
I might actually run a clapometer on the next question. That comes from Mr. Foreman. I'm sorry, I'm taking 2, not 4. You have to ask the lady. Okay, I do apologise, Mr. Foreman, but we cannot have your question.
Well, you've already accepted my question.
Yeah, I did, but I neglected to ask the speaker, would she answer? She said no. So we will move on with the next speaker on my list. I think is Mr. Campenosi.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Madam President. Somebody said this is a déjà vu debate, and it's true. It's been more than 3 years that we've been debating Brexit. and we've been watching events unfold, but it's actually not their fault as much as though in Brussels, because for them it's a big joke. They say the Brits don't really want to join. The fact is that it's exactly the other way around, and at the end of the day we now have an agreement. We'll see whether that is satisfactory or not. We'll see where that takes us. However, Europe, looking at the rest of the world, is not doing so well. It's not really a leading player. There are international crises which it uses purely for its own interests to destabilise the UK, for example, with Scottish independence. And we've seen many examples, such as Brexit. And let's see whether anyone else does a Brexit in future years.
For 1 minute, Mr. Lundgren.
Thank you. The situation in Turkey is completely unacceptable. The country is becoming ever more authoritarian and less democratic, and the EU should break off any form of economic aid to the country and any form of agreement relating to a possible future membership. This must immediately cease. The signal must be clear. You in Turkey have disqualified yourselves from future cooperation. When it comes to the budget, after the UK leaves, the budget must become smaller, obviously. What makes you believe in this House that my country, Sweden, would be interested to pay a further 15 billion Swedish krona to the EU? We've always been one of the biggest net contributors. Enough's enough. Not a further cent more will you get. Instead of that, we should start a debate about how we can get back what the EU was from the very beginning, a peace and a trade-promoting organisation as opposed to an empire-building organisation. Thank you.
1 minute, Mr. Carthy.
The border in Ireland is already too hard. It has frustrated the economic, social and political development in our country and resulted in a conflict for which too many paid too high a price. The Good Friday Agreement and our shared membership of the EU have together been the instruments that have allowed us to undo some of the damages of partition over the past 2 decades. That is why Brexit has been such a dangerous development. It has risked our peace process and our all-Ireland economy. Even the deal that was negotiated last week will create new problems for and relating to the border in Ireland. We support it because it is better than the alternative. But the deal cannot be further diluted. There can be no veto, no opportunity for any one party to hold every business, every farm, every worker, every community across the island of Ireland to ransom. To suggest that such a veto would represent consent is absurd and is a ludicrous misreading of the Good Friday Agreement. Of course, the best way to protect our country from the dangers of Brexit is through a united Ireland. The EU can play a role in supporting the peaceful, democratic pathway to that objective, and I hope that this House is ready and willing to be part of the big constitutional conversation that's coming our way.
For 1 minute, Mr. Nicolau Alavanos. Left Terrace.
President, it's dangerous for peoples, the decisions by Council. There are major contradictions in the European Union. It's a competitor with Russia and America. They all want to see how they can impose their will on the Middle East. We're talking about sanctions, whereas actually the events in northern Syria tell us everything. Turkey is drilling in the Cyprus exclusive economic zone. And now with North Macedonia and Albania, what that tells us is that the bourgeoisie in France wants to win time, wants to gain time, is playing for time, even if it brings problems for the countries affected by the Prespa agreement. the new democracy government and Syriza, their position is dangerous for our people, and we have got to keep up our fight against these imperialist plans. Thank you.
Mr González Pons for 1.5 minutes.
Jean-Claude, he vuelto la vista atrás y en estos...
Thank you. We've had at least 15 major crises as we look back over the last 5 years: migration, Euro, Greece, Brexit, Russian invasion of Ukraine, fake news, Dieselgate, climate crisis, Paris summit, terrorist attacks, rise of populism, crisis for rule of law in some EU member states, the legitimacy of the institutions with the failure of the Spitzenkandidat process, the demographic crisis, trade war between the US and China, Brexit, probably the worst populist nationalist decision of all, because nobody is more lost than someone who doesn't know where they're going, the failed coup in Spain, the attempts to break up Europe, starting with Spain. Jean-Claude, a tricky 5 years. But the EU 27 are more united than ever, we're stronger than ever, and Europe is the best political invention in the history of humanity. Thank you, Jean-Claude. Thank you, Commission, Miguel, Johannes, Michel. I'm looking at all of you. However difficult the times to come, we have an example in you of serenity, love of the European project, and how to meet expectations. And as I may be a Latino, but politically I feel a Luxembourger in your company, Jean-Claude. That's Europe.
Thank you. Mr Corbett, would you please be quiet? You're very disrespectful to the speakers. I'll move now. Mr Corbett, 1.5 minutes. Thank you. And please listen to the speaker.
Indeed, good point. The British government is trying to force through the deal in the House of Commons in 3 days' time to hold 3 readings and the committee stage. A new 110-page long bill that has not been published before, a 600-page agreement that has recently been changed. No impact assessments are going to have been published on this. There is no certainty that this ruse will work, or that this deal will be approved, at least in its current form. There will be amendments tabled, however short the period. Some amendments to try and have a softer Brexit, because make no mistake, this is a hard Brexit that takes Britain away from Europe, outside the customs union, outside the single market. It will be damaging for Britain's economy, damaging for the European economy. It's a bad deal for Britain and a bad deal for Europe. But there will also be amendments to say that any Brexit outcome, any deal, must go back to the public for a final decision. And that is only right, because Brexit is turning out to be so completely different from what was promised by those Leave campaigners 3.5 years ago. It's Leave voters who are entitled to say, that's not what I was told, this is not what I voted for. I want to have a say again. And that is the mood of British public opinion, as demonstrated on Saturday in London. That is what most opinion polls tell us the British public want and deserve a right to reconsider this disastrous decision for our country. Thank you.
Mr Corbett, there are rather 2 blue card requests. I will only take one because I've been informed we have 20 people on the Catch the Eye. So do you want to accept a question from Mr Dobney? I hope I've said that right. Mr Dobney.
Yes. I would like to ask Mr Corbett, what would he say to 5 million Labour voters in 60% of Labour seats who voted to leave the European Union? How could you explain to them that you have not betrayed their vote by your party demanding they are forced to vote again in a second referendum? You should be ashamed of your party.
Most Labour voters, even in Leave seats, voted Remain at the time of the referendum. That is now even more the case because Labour Leave voters have now seen that Brexit is a right-wing neoliberal project driven by the right wing of the Tory party that will harm workplace rights, that will harm their economy, that will cost jobs, that will do no good whatsoever to Britain. And that's why the Labour Party has rightly taken the position that any Brexit outcome now should go back to the public to decide. Thank you.
Mr Kelleher, for 1 minute, please.
Just to say at the outset, I again accept the fact that the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. But in that context, I think it's important that those that were supporting the UK leaving will acknowledge that by leaving without a deal, it will have profound implications on the island of Ireland, and it will have profound implications for the peace process. The fact of the matter is that this particular issue was not debated during the referendum itself, and it has now become a key issue in the context of the withdrawal agreement and the discussions between the European Union and the UK. But let us be very clear. It is not the European Union that is stalling the UK leaving the European Union. It is the UK Parliament itself. And they are involved in a process. And whatever comes from that process, it has to be close to the withdrawal agreement that has been agreed to ensure there is no diminution of the impact on the island of Ireland that this particular agreement is there to protect. So I would say that we need to ensure that we have proper democratic scrutiny in the House of Commons, and for that to come to a conclusion, and here in the European Parliament. And finally, may I say, there can be no diminution of European citizens' rights in Northern Ireland, people from the European Union that have made Northern Ireland their home. It would be a shameful process if we had deportation of European citizens from the island of Ireland.
For 1 minute, Madam Reinteke.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear colleagues, there is currently a tale being told in the UK, and to be honest, some of the statements of people also here in this room haven't really helped it. And this tale is that the EU is tired of us, they want to get rid of us, and they want to mind their own business. And we have to make absolutely clear, this Parliament is still also the Parliament of the British citizens. The EU is not tired of the UK. The EU is not tired of British people. And also, the EU is not tired of having sensible and constructive negotiations. This project is built on multilateralism, so we love negotiating and finding common solutions. But what we are tired of is prime ministers that are giving promises that they cannot live up to. What we are tired of are prime ministers that are using divisive language in a moment especially like this. What we are tired of are prime ministers who don't understand that in case that they are not going to get this deal through the House of Commons, they will have to put it back to the people so that the British people can decide on this finally. Thank you very much.
Mr Madison, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, congratulations for the Brexit Party, because probably for the next month you're not here anymore. And that's a good thing, because there are not many things where I can agree with Mr Juncker, but as he said 5 days ago, there is no argument for the further delay. So the Brexit has to be done. For the dear colleagues from the left side who are saying about democracy, about that somebody's afraid of the new referendum, I would like to say that I'm pretty sure that in the UK there are millions of voters who are not satisfied that you are here in the European Parliament. What should we do? Should we make a new elections for the European Parliament because they are not satisfied with the results of the elections? Of course not. They're after 5 years. Same thing with a new referendum. Maybe in 10 years or in 20 years you can organise a new referendum to join with the EU. But I'm pretty sure that it will not happen because the Conservatives or the Brexit Party or the right Conservatives will win anyway the next elections because they have done the Brexit. Thank you and good luck.
Now for 1 minute, Mr Hannan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. What really grates here is not the dishonesty of our MPs, but the credit that they're giving to our intelligence. They could have just rejected Brexit. They could have just refused to implement Article 50. But instead, they have again and again lied and concealed their true motives. They thought that if they could string things out beyond last week, that people would blame Boris rather than the people doing the stringing out. They think that if they keep calling for an election but voting against, we somehow won't notice. They think that if they amend a bill to death with the intention of stopping it, again, we're going to fall for it. They seem to have believed their own propaganda about all Leave voters being stupid. And every time they have miscalculated. The reality is the Conservative Party in every poll now has been ahead for the last 40 opinion polls, generally in double digits. The only options we have are either to take this deal now and become good neighbours rather than grudging tenants, or there will be an outright victory for the Conservatives at the next election and tougher terms. Those are the only two options now left.
Mr. Hannan, Mr. Smith has requested a question. You will accept, Mr. Smith. Go ahead.
Thank you, and I am grateful to Mr Hannan for giving way, and I very warmly endorse his criticism of dishonest politicians. In exactly that vein, would he like to apologise for his oft-repeated quote that nobody is talking about leaving the single market, which he said repeatedly during the Leave campaign, and indeed his subsequent conversion that EU citizens' rights are not going to be the same? Would he like to apologise for his previous positions and set the record straight?
It's simply not the case that I repeatedly said that during the election campaign. You're looking at a quote from a 2015 interview before the campaign began, in which I made very clear, and I've stuck to that position all the way through, that I thought the best outcome for us would be a Swiss-type outcome. And that's a position that I took before, during and since the campaign. I have not changed my position. I wonder whether you, who have made your entire career about demanding a referendum on independence for one part of the UK, might consider the hypocrisy of refusing to accept the verdict when the UK as a whole votes for independence.
Colleagues, I will move to the next speaker. I know there is further requests for blue card questions. I'm taking one, and I may indeed, in a few speakers down the list, have to close blue card because of the pressure on Catch the Eye. 1 minute, Mr. Farage.
Well, after 3 agonising years of negotiations, Michel Barnier gets Boris Johnson to sign us up to a brand new treaty, which guarantees 3 more years of agonising negotiations and, frankly, reduces the United Kingdom to the status of a colony of the European Union. And why is Boris doing it? He's doing it because he doesn't want extension. He's doing it because he knows that extension damages the Conservative Party in the polls. So he wants to bounce us in to this new treaty before we wake up. It's the same story every time. It's about the Tory party, not about the country. And what we need is to build a Leave alliance of those across the political spectrum to fight and win the next general election. The only way we can leave this place is with a clean break Brexit. I would like to think, like Mr Juncker, that this is my last speech here in 20 years, but somehow I've got the feeling, I'm sorry, I'd love it to be,
Would you let him finish?
You'd love it to be,
Colleague,
but I have
please.
a feeling we'll be back in November.
I'm really sorry, but we missed the very end of Mr. Farage's last speech because you were all cheering. However, let me move immediately to Mr. Tajani for 1.5 minutes.
Signor Presidente.
Madam President, dear Donald, dear Jean-Claude, I share your indignation at the lack of result in Council and the lack of attention to the Balkans. China, Russia, Saudi Arabia are investing energy and resources in the Balkans, and we are stepping back and not helping the stability of this area, which is essential for the stability of all of Europe. Not a positive message, a negative message. It was a tremendous blunder which condemns Europe to progressive political irrelevance in the region. But we've made the same mistakes by not taking courageous steps in the Middle East. We should be saying clearly, loud and clear to Turkey, don't invade that part of Syria. The terrorists, terrorists, if there are Kurdish terrorists, are in Turkey. They should be arrested there. And this is another blunder. A Christian minority exists in Syria. What are we doing to them? We continue to make errors and mistakes because of the egoism, self-centeredness of individual countries. they're not up to being protagonists and powers in the land further afield. In the area of trade, we should be condemning the illegal state aids to steel, which bear down on our steel manufacturers. If we want to punch our weight, we have got to have a strategy so we can play our part on the world stage. And I believe that Europe has to head for reforms and get back to politics. If we don't get back to politics, we are doomed to irrelevance in the decades to come. Thank you.
For 1 minute, Madam Marquis.
President, I would like to address some words to Mr. Juncker first. Throughout your term of office, you have respected the principle of respect for diversity, and it's a very important principle. If we look at the Council conclusions on the multi-annual financial framework, there were differences of opinion between the EU 27 in relation to the Finnish presidency proposal. The broad majority, overwhelming majority of member states disagree with the presidency. So the conclusions don't take account of that or the view of this House, the European Parliament. This is a failure to take into account the political commitments that Ms von der Leyen has also entered into. There's a negotiating box which is different to what leaders of countries and institutions have said they would do. So we need to ensure that a solid, sufficient budget can be adopted by the 1st of January 2021. We need to be ready, but we don't need to accept time pressure which could have a negative impact on the final decision. We've been negotiating this since last November.
For 1 minute.
Messieurs les Présidents,
Presidents, Commissioners, Donald Tusk, you have reached an agreement with the President of the Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, who I salute. Let's respect European rules. Let us also respect the sovereign choice of the British people. And I would like to denounce Mr. Nigel Farage's position here, 20 years fighting Europe, 20 years during which he has been sustained by Europe. The important thing today is the future relationship, and I would like to welcome the work done by Michel Barnier and his work on keeping cohesion amongst the 28 countries, and Michel Séguin behind him. I would like to thank as well for having maintained a vision for a project taking Europe forward. Another delay, we may need another one, but I think this should only be possible if there is a reason, something new. In any case, I would wish to commend your work to allow the European project to move forward into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Madam Scott Cato.
Thank you, President. Although Johnson is trying to bounce the Westminster Parliament into rubber stamping the Brexit deal, our Parliament should do its job properly. We need to accord this treaty that is so crucial to the interests of the EU and the UK sufficient scrutiny. Since Brexit was clearly intended as an attack on European standards and on the integrity of the single market, we must not allow Brexit fatigue to weaken our resolve. We must defend those standards. We welcomed Mr Barnier's idea of the level playing field, preventing the UK from undercutting the single market and its standards on environment, workers' rights and tax. But in this deal, Johnson has moved those restrictions from the withdrawal agreement to the political declaration, which will not be legally binding. This is a clear signal that they are preparing the UK to become Singapore-on-Thames and is a threat to the integrity of the single market. Our European Parliament has already agreed that we will not agree the deal before the Westminster Parliament does, and we must stick to that in spite of any pressure that might come from the Council to make hasty and risky decisions. Our job is to ensure that we protect the European project and the interests of present and future EU citizens.
For 1 minute, Mr. Panza.
Sì, buongiorno Presidente.
Thank you, Madam President. The conclusions from the Commission on climate change leave much to be desired, as always. They have been using an ideological approach which doesn't solve any of the problems in the real world. Coming from Verbania in Piemonte, where we have seen floods, landslides, roads which have been swept away. Climate change, I think what we should be doing, rather than having international conferences, is looking at the local authority level where there has been graft. In this particular case, there is a Solidarity Fund, and the Commission has been proposing to Council that it should be used not for floods and landslides, but to pay for the possible eventual damage done to the European Union by Brexit, at a time when solidarity is sorely needed by those who've suffered with the floods and natural disasters of recent times. Thank you.
Mr. Sinčić.
Thank you very much, Mr. Juncker, Mr. Tusk. You shed tears here because Britain wants to leave. You are surprised that there are problems when it comes to accession talks with North Macedonia and Albania. I'll tell you why Croats have become so disenchanted with the EU. Our Prime Minister promised that when we enter Europe we will no longer have problems with corruption and the judiciary, but this did not happen and people got disillusioned. Croatia is one of the most corrupt countries in Europe. This is supported by reports that keep coming out, and you decided to trust such a corrupted country. For 10,000 euros you can buy a court decision in Croatia, decision of any state institution. The state institutions function in the following way in Croatia. They ask someone who is a thief, are you a thief? He responds, I'm not a thief, and then they conclude that the crime was not committed. And this is how things went on for decades. People expected that you would introduce higher standards in Croatia, but the opposite happened. You accepted the decision of the Croatian judiciary on the assets of Dubravka Šuica, for instance, and instead of introducing high European standards in Croatia, the opposite happened.
We'll accept a question from Mr. Sokol. Mr. Sinčić, I'm speaking to you. There is a blue card request from Mr. Sokol. Will you accept? Thank you. Put your question, please.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sinčić, this is not the first time that you're lying and deceiving, and this is why I'd like to... Why are you doing this? Why did you do everything for Dubravka Šuica not to be nominated, whereas the Legal Affairs Committee said that everything was fine? So you made a problem to your own country. Please do not act like this. Please explain why you are trying to damage Croatia.
Go ahead.
Mr. Sokol, I hope that you are aware of the Croatian Criminal Code, which talks about bribing MPs. I have talked about this at length in the Croatian public, about the assets of Ms. Šuica, and you will see that Europe trusted Croatian institutions. So someone is trusting the most corrupt institutions without any check. Mr. Kolakušić was a judge for 20 years. Do you think that it is by chance that he was elected here? No, he was elected because people are dissatisfied with the Croatian judiciary.
Speaker for 1 minute, Mr. Tobe.
Thank you very much. When it comes to Brexit, the decisive thing is that Europe should continue to keep a cool head. We mustn't allow Boris Johnson's domestic agenda to ensure that somebody like Macron, who doesn't have sufficient tolerance to steer this process, and we must make sure that there is sufficient time granted, an extension, or if the Westminster Parliament decides it, a further referendum. As far as I'm concerned, it's keeping Europe together that's important. That is what must guide this process. And the most dangerous thing for the UK and the EU would be a no-deal Brexit. I think the best thing would be if the British were to remain in the Union, but if there is to be an exit, then we need to maintain good relations, and that is how we will keep Europe together.
Thank you. Mr. Benifei, for 1 minute, please.
Thank you. The Council conclusions are disappointing and make it clear that for once and for all the EU needs to give itself instruments to govern the process of transformation in the modern world. I think it's a very serious occurrence that leaders are not able to take a step forward with the MFF and disagree on virtually everything: national contributions, cuts to cohesion, own resources. And this delay with the roadmap means that we're letting our territories and citizens down. And in the case of Syria, Erdogan's military intervention has left the Kurds abandoned. We need to call for a no-flight zone, economic and commercial sanctions to hit the interests of the Turkish government. These are key issues that should be at the heart of European Council discussions, and inertia is not good enough, but unfortunately the EU is still stuck in it.
Colleagues, I just want to make an announcement on blue cards. We will close that now because we have 22 colleagues also on Catch the Eye, so I'm closing both lists. So it's going to be difficult to facilitate everybody. Now, Madam Haranzova, for 1 minute, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. While Brexit is the talk of the day, I would like to voice my regret to the Council conclusions on enlargement. North Macedonia and Albania have done everything we have asked of them. They have made important changes at real political costs. Yet what kind of message are we sending to them today? For those who oppose negotiations, they must make clear what further actions is needed. And moreover, they must help North Macedonia and Albania to complete these actions through financial and political measures. We cannot leave these countries without a clear path forward. North Macedonia and Albania are European states, and therefore it is our duty to them and ourselves to start enlargement process. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Bardella.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. À chaque nouvelle crise internationale, force est de
With each new crisis, we see how Europe cannot act, and all European actors have condemned the invasion by Turkey of Syria, and as a result of Sultan Erdogan's actions. There needs to be a reprimand. We need to put an end to arms exports to Turkey, for which we're all responsible. Article 29 of the European Union Treaty put in place an embargo against such exports, but there are the customs barriers, and we need to bring them in, and we need to make Erdogan negotiate. But in the 19th century, it was said of the Ottoman Empire that they were the sick man of Europe, but today it is we, the Europeans, who are sick. Masochism, which is making us spend billions to stem migration, to prevent migration, and it is now time for us to choose. Otherwise, history will be making that choice in our place.
Mrs. Dodds, for 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Madam President. So, another European Council, another deal, and an even bigger capitulation by Boris Johnson. The Prime Minister, who on the 2nd of October said that the UK should leave the European Union whole and entire, has signed up to a deal where Northern Ireland would apply the European Union Customs Code. Northern Ireland businesses will pay EU tariffs on goods used in the manufacturing process. And just yesterday, after checking what on earth he had negotiated, the Brexit Secretary confirmed that goods coming from Northern Ireland to GB will be subject to customs paperwork, an estimated cost of up to £65 per declaration. Given that 70% of all of Northern Ireland's trade is within the United Kingdom, this is a huge barrier to the Northern Ireland economy. A separation of Northern Ireland in customs and regulation from its own internal market. If all this was done for an independent trade policy, one prominent Northern Ireland economist has already declared that Northern Ireland would become a spectator in any UK trade deals. A shameful position. As Boris Johnson used to say, no British Prime Minister could ever sign up to it.
Our next speaker, for 1 minute, Mr. Niedermayer.
Thank you very much, Madam. Please let me not speak about the Brexit. I want to speak about the European Council. And at the beginning, let me thank Mr. Tusk and Mr. Juncker for dedication and effort that they shown in the previous Council, but even years before. But we can see that sometimes the dedication and effort is not enough. So I have one quite a pressing issue. The question if the Council is the place of cooperation, mutual respect and responsibility where good common solutions are found for the future, or if it's the place for political games, disagreement and sometimes even inconsistent decisions. It seems to me that in the last Council, the second prevailed over the first. I hope it is the exception, otherwise we are heading towards the problems. Thank you very much.
Mr. Schieder, for 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Madam President. Brexit is turning into a never-ending story. It's now the third Prime Minister in the UK who's been responsible, and it's gone from bad to worse, to even worse. And this is the result of the split in the Tories. It's the result of political egotism on the part of Prime Minister Johnson and the selfish plays, selfish games on the backs of ordinary citizens in the UK. If Brexit comes, there's got to be a sensible deal, and any kind of Brexit will mean less social rights, less consumer protection, less money for the NHS in the UK, and because of that it's a very bad idea. Madam President, the UK government cannot be prevented from making a mistake if that's what they want, but we don't have to make mistakes as well. This European Parliament can only decide on the deal once the British Parliament, both houses, has taken its decision, and then it's our turn.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Kuchuk.
Thank you very much, Mrs. President. Ladies and gentlemen, the last European Council was very important. Efforts were made to overcome the crisis, the humanitarian crisis in northern Syria. There were also efforts made in order to conclude an agreement on the MFF. Brexit was also an important topic. The UK is about to leave the European Union. Boris Johnson wanted the UK to leave on the 28th of October, but he has no real go. We should support postponing Brexit because we saw what all people in the UK wanted the last weekend. I cannot refrain but mention the historic mistake made as far as North Macedonia and Albania are concerned. Any postponement of the negotiation process, of the start of the negotiation process, is a mistake. We need to offer stability to the region, and we should not offer North Macedonia and Albania. Thank you.
Madam Gansha. We will move. I can't see the colleague I've just called, so for 1 minute, Mr. Christoforou, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to say thank you to the European Council and its major decisions, taking measures against the expansive aggression and aggressiveness of Turkey, with its actions encroaching on the Cyprus exclusive economic area. Can I thank also President Tusk for the past 5 years, and also Jean-Claude Juncker in the Commission, who have upgraded their institutions, and the Parliament, the European Union, has grown in stature because of them. Over the past 5 years, we've seen very unfortunate developments in the Republic of Cyprus, in Cyprus. We have got to counter the expansionist, aggressive policies of Turkey before it's too late. And I listened to Manfred Weber today, who said that Turkey cannot continue to benefit from the internal market and from the customs union at a time when they're invading Syria, and when they are breaching the sovereign rights of a member state of the European Union. I believe there should be, as Mr. Weber said, an economic price to pay for Turkey. Only then will they realise that we are a community of values, and that we are prepared to defend those values. Only then will the Union demonstrate that it's a power in the land, and that it must be respected. Thank you.
So, next speaker, Mr. Pizzula, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Last week's council meeting could not be described as business as usual. Several important topics were overshadowed by Brexit discussions, and this is confirmed by the fact that the conclusions on Syria lacked substance and the MFF was only briefly referred to. I'm sorry that the unity and consensus on the updated Brexit deal were not complemented by the decision to open accession talks with the North Macedonia and Albania. Both of these topics affect our credibility and our capacity to act as a global actor in increasingly turbulent political times. While we face complex geopolitical challenges, we must increase our influence in the neighborhood. Our determination to try to avoid a disorderly Brexit and to protect the rights of our citizens is unquestionable, but this will depend on our partners in London. But the policy of enlargement and the support to the governments who are devoted to the reforms depends exclusively on us.
Thank you, Chair. First, I'd like to say that we cannot imagine European politics in the last decades without President Juncker. And I would like to praise you, not for your political activity, but because you are a true European and a true humanist. And I would dedicate to you a quote of Montesquieu that can summarize your thought. If I knew something useful to my fatherland which were prejudicial to Europe, or something which were useful to Europe and prejudicial to mankind, I would consider it a crime. This is a good summary of your thought and of your action. E agora queria apenas dar...
I also wanted to comment on the European Council. 2 comments. Firstly, I fully agree with the positions adopted on the UK and Brexit. We need to be open to the people of the UK, but we need to firmly defend our European vision. Defending Europe also means defending the UK. And my other comment, I'm from the wild west of Europe, but turning to the Balkans, I think this is shameful. We should have opened the negotiating process with North Macedonia and Albania. They need us, and we in the wild west of Europe also needed Europe in our time, and so I feel the same for them now.
For 1 minute, Mr. Moreno Sanchez.
Thank you, President. Dear Jean-Claude, dear Michel, I only have 1 minute, but I couldn't let this opportunity pass to pay tribute to your European vocation. We owe you a lot. In Spanish, Brexit has thrust us into chaos. Looking at what's happening in the House of Commons, it's still chaos. I still think it's preferable to postpone Brexit rather than have a hard Brexit. But we need to look at other priorities too. We need an ambitious multi-annual financial framework. We need to go way beyond 1% of GDP. As some heads of state and government said at the Council, this should be a priority. We also need to meet the challenges of migration, climate change and the digital agenda. We also need resources to combat youth unemployment, long-term unemployment and our gender strategy. We also need to strengthen traditional European policies such as the CAP and territorial cohesion. We cannot continue with this rural exodus with a growing gap between rich and poor.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, 1 minute.
October the 31st is a little over a week away, and of course that brings to mind this time of the year: Halloween, pumpkins, ghosts, all things spooky. And some people might get carried away and want to die in a ditch in the spirit of Halloween, but that wouldn't apply to most of us. So for that reason, I think in terms of the withdrawal agreement, it's very important that we take our time and get it right. We have waited 3 years. If we have to wait another 3 weeks or 3 months, it's better to take our time and get it right than rush and get it wrong. Having said that, the updated withdrawal agreement is something that is better than a disorderly exit. And definitely Prime Minister Johnson and Taoiseach Leo Varadkar and Michel Barnier deserve credit for the speed at which they worked to get this in order. However, as I said, we must take our time and get it right. Finally, I would also like to be associated with González Pons and Mr Rangel and other people's comments in relation to President Juncker. You have had a fantastic 5 years. You have shown great leadership, enjoyed great success, and Europe will always be very grateful to you.
Colleagues, thank you very much. Now comes the really difficult part. 22 requests for Catch the Eye. I can only take 7. I'm under strict instructions. So first, Mr. Kyrtsos, 1 minute, please.
President, I'm worried that Mrs Merkel and Mr Macron do not agree on Syria. They don't agree on the whole question of enlargement to the Western Balkans, on the MFF, on countering the Turkish threat, and on standing up to Russia as well. And when they don't agree, it becomes a cacophony, and that greatly weakens our hand. Can I thank President Juncker for what he's done for my country of Greece, quite apart from political appurtenance, because President Juncker loves Greece and loves the Greeks, despite our foibles and our failings. I want to return. Also, his love has been selfless, and I'd like to thank him for all his efforts.
Thank you. Ms Ward, please.
Thank you, President. The European Council are playing games with all of us. They were quite happy to go along with Boris Johnson's timeline for Brexit, but not to follow the long-held EU line encouraging North Macedonia and Albania to join our European project. The Council were willing to accept the promises of a liar Prime Minister in the UK, but not willing to keep their word when it comes to good neighbours in the Balkans.
We have made a promise to North Macedonia and Albania, and not honouring that promise could be a historic mistake. Regarding the UK, what kind of international treaty should be rushed through without proper process or scrutiny? The Council has tried to bounce this issue back onto the European Parliament without allowing sufficient time for consideration and reflection before rejection or ratification. Brexit will not magically go away. If the deal passes, this is just the end of the beginning rather than the beginning of the end. Now begins the hard part.
Mr. Ansip.
Madam President, dear Jean-Claude, dear colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank Jean-Claude, you for this really good leadership. But now about Brexit. After Brexit referendum, we got strong statements from London. Brexit means Brexit. Out means out. No deal is better than bad deal. During the last 5 years, as Commission Vice President responsible for digital single market, I used to deal with very practical issues. We were able to abolish roaming surcharges in the European Union. But what will happen with those roaming surcharges after the Brexit? It will depend on negotiations between EU 27 and the United Kingdom. We were able to agree in general data protection regulation to protect the privacy of our people, and we were able to agree in free data flows to support our industries. And we all know UK is really good in cloud service cloud service provider. But what will happen with data flows after the Brexit? It will depend on deal. So.
Sorry, it is 1 minute, Mr. Ansip, and it is catch the eye, but thank you. I'll give the floor to our next speaker, Madam Chowns, for 1 minute.
Colleagues, I thank all of you for your patience with the nightmare of Brexit so far. I too deeply regret this. I too believe it's been a waste of time and energy. And I agree with so many of you. Things should not be artificially rushed now. On Saturday, I marched with hundreds of thousands of people through my capital city, London, to call for a people's vote on any final deal. You'll have seen the pictures, a sea of pro-European sentiment on the streets of London. That is the will of the people. It has changed since 2016. 74 out of 75 polls in the last year show a majority for Remain. So please, friends, be in no doubt about the strength of pro-European feeling in the UK. And yet, here we are. Our new Prime Minister, who has lost every single vote in the House of Commons so far, a historically unprecedented record of failure, is asking the EU to help dig him out of his own ditch. He wants the Council and this House to increase the pressure in Westminster. But the deal raises very serious questions. We know the aim of the Brexiteers is to undermine social and environmental standards, so hard-won, not to increase them. We know Johnson cannot be trusted. That's why this deal needs thorough scrutiny here and in Westminster.
Thank you. Mr. Wells, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. The United Kingdom has been a good customer and friend of the European Union and its member states. In the 20 years to 2018, the EU enjoyed a total trade surplus of nearly 750 billion with the UK. The UK has also contributed a net figure of 120 billion to the EU project over the same period. And the UK is one of only 6 member states that meet NATO defence spending commitments that provide security to everybody in this place. Given this, I would like to know why Messrs Juncker, Tusk and Barnier feel that it's okay to meet UK opposition leaders and the likes of Tony Blair in a blatant attempt to interfere in British politics. It seems Martin Selmayr hinted at the EU intent when he was overheard saying that Northern Ireland would be the price that Britain would pay for Brexit. Is it not the truth that the British people have been treated in contempt by the EU in these negotiations?
Thank you. Mr. Bogovic, for 1 minute.
Thank you for the floor.
I am sincerely thankful to Mr. Tusk for his voice of reason over the 5 years. Thanks for the proactive approach of Mr. Juncker and the wonderful results of Mr. Barnier in terms of Brexit. I come from Slovenia. We have been quite hit by the fact that the Council rejected the opening of the accession talks with North Macedonia and Albania. We come from a region where we understand that peace is not just taken for granted. I know that a lot of reforms have to be taken in these two countries, and such signals from the councils are really worrying. And those of us who know this part of Europe and who visit this part of Europe to bring it closer to the European Union, we find ourselves in great difficulties. Thank to Mr. Hahn for his achievements in the Balkans, but I believe that after such decisions of the European Union, the balance in the region will be changed.
Aguilar.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, President Tusk, President Juncker. I'd like to echo the words of congratulation. During your terms of office, we've been through the worst crisis of European history. Brexit will be the historical landmark. And Mr. Barnier, you have kept unity and reciprocity, which is equally important. We need assurances that the EU will treat Brits in the EU in the same way that the UK treats Europeans on its own territory. But this ticking clock is a ticking time bomb. The final decision, chaos, is taking us closer to a chaotic no-deal exit. There's a political battle against reactionary populism based on fake news and poisoning the debate. This lie that the national interest is incompatible. There's a clash between it and the European interest. Resources, 1% is not enough. Hypocrisy should be abhorred, and we need to put our money where our mouth is. If we make promises, we need to ensure we have the resources.
Monsieur Barnier, a voi la parola.
Mr. Barnier, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mesdames et Messieurs les députés, avec...
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, perhaps I could say a few words to respond to the many people who've spoken on the difficult matter of Brexit. I'd like to thank President Weber for his confidence, and Mrs. Garcia Perez, Mr. Cholos, Mr. Lamberts, and Mr. Shirdovan for their support over the last many months and their trust. We think, as President Tusk and President Juncker do as well, that this Parliament should be accorded the greatest respect because we're in the midst of this difficult Brexit process, and we've respected this Parliament, and it will be this House that has the final word, and it is therefore only normal that the British Parliament now take its responsibilities and commit itself as the first one to the negotiated basis with the British government rather than against it or without it, in order to obtain what we all wished to have with regard to Brexit, an orderly exit. And I would repeat once again that if Britain wants an orderly exit, which is far better than a disorderly exit, then this is the only possible agreement. And it seems legitimate to us that your Parliament, when it gives its consent, should know without ambiguity what it is that the UK has decided and wishes for its own future. So there we are. We're at this very difficult moment in this long process, and since I have the possibility to say to Mr. Donald Tusk, on behalf of Mr. Juncker and all the commissioners that I would like to thank everybody for the trust placed in me. That trust that was placed there from the outset by President Juncker was that I should help to create a treaty for an orderly Brexit, and nothing more and nothing less. That's what we've done. It's been very complicated. I wasn't particularly surprised by that, but the Brexit negotiation is a negative one. It's a lose-lose scenario. Nobody, even Mr. Farage, has been able to demonstrate to me that there is any added value from Brexit. And we've conducted these negotiations, these negative negotiations, by taking them very seriously. And we've tried to respect the British vote, even if we regret it. Throughout these 3 years, we've worked on the basis of objectivity, trying to tenaciously and patiently work out operational options that would work legally to bring about solutions to each of the problems that Brexit presents for all and for everywhere. And we've tried to respect our British partners in this process because, ladies and gentlemen, we have, as far as the UK is concerned, great respect and even admiration. And we have worked without allowing ourselves to be influenced by the internal political discussions, turbulent as they are in the UK, and we've done this in a dispassionate manner based on facts, the legal bases and the actual problems that Brexit creates in order to try and find solutions. And we've tried to keep in mind where this is going, because Brexit isn't the end of the story, it's not a destination, and we've tried to keep that in mind through the negotiations. First of all, by taking into account peace in Northern Ireland. Every single day, this has been one of the requirements that we had to abide by, doing something that would not upset the fragile peace in Northern Ireland. And also, we have kept in mind our very underpinnings, the internal market, which is more than a free trade zone. It's about social and other things, and we have to keep the negotiations in that context. There was always the priority of the European Parliament, and our priority as well, which was the rights of European citizens. 4.5 million people, 1.5 million of them British, living in the EU, and 3 million at least EU citizens living in the UK. And I've heard Mr. Verhofstadt, Mrs. Hübner, well, many people express their concerns on that. And if the agreement is voted on by the British Parliament and by yourselves, then the 4.5 million people that I've just referenced will see their rights upheld in a sustainable manner for themselves and for their families, and this is the best guarantee for citizens. And the UK has committed itself to implementing this new agreement in a practical way, and we will ensure that we keep an eye on that being the case. So the pressure must be kept up to make sure that commitments entered into by the UK are maintained. And we've always kept in mind throughout these negotiations, because Brexit isn't the end of the story, what we have to rebuild with the UK. What we're doing at the moment is unpicking 44 years of cooperation. The British will be leaving more than 600 international agreements. But this isn't where it ends. The UK remains where it is, our friend, our ally, our partner, and we have to rebuild. I was surprised Mr. Farage is no longer here. Well, fortunately, saying that this agreement opens the door to 3 further years of negotiation. Well, of course. We're going to have to negotiate beyond Brexit and the divorce settlement, maybe 2, 3 or more years for some areas, to rebuild everything that's had to be unpicked as a result of the desire of those who wish Brexit. And we have to get a balanced agreement following all of the rules to avoid tax, social or environmental dumping. And we have to make sure that we have university, Erasmus, research, police, judicial, security, defence, cooperation. Foreign policy as well. All of these areas where we are going to have to work on a long-term basis with the UK in a new context and in a new political framework. And that is what lies ahead for us, and that is what the European Commission under President Juncker and the President-elect Ms von der Leyen in their services. So I'd like to finish by picking up on what Mr. Van Orden said earlier on, saying that there are lessons to be learned from Brexit, and obviously there are. There are consequences of Brexit. They are very many. Often they've been underestimated, notably in the UK, and we're facing up to that. But there are lessons of Brexit. Why did 52% of the British vote against Europe? As a politician, I've always recommended that you should take a step back to think about these things, because this is what affects all of us in the 27 EU countries. And there is a lesson there. There's a lesson that Mr. Farage and his friends sometimes have forgotten, which is that you have to tell the truth to the citizens before they vote. It is our responsibility to tell the truth to the citizens. But behind the Brexit vote there is social anger, often expressed by people saying the EU doesn't protect people enough. There's deindustrialization, there's a need for greater protection, more reform. So there's a positive agenda that is going to be far more important than Brexit. And this is the commitment that Mrs. von der Leyen and her new team have made, that they wish to pursue that new positive agenda. But having been given the privilege of doing this job for the last 3 years, that it is President Juncker's commitment and his team of commissioners here today to say goodbye. It is a great privilege to have worked alongside them, and I would like to thank them for the trust they placed in me. I know he started off with his team by picking out what is most important for all of us, which is the commitment for a positive agenda for Europe and for European citizens. Thank you very much for listening.
Grazie, Monsieur Barnier.
Thank you, Mr. Barnier. I'll now give the floor to Council President, Mr. Tusk. You have the floor.
Grazie, Presidente. Thank you for all your warm words about me. It was worth waiting 5 years for such a moment. Thank you as well for your responsible position on Brexit and the extension. Through this, you show common sense and a sense of dignity. After what I have heard today in this chamber, I have no doubt that we should treat the British request for extension in all seriousness. Thank you. Goodbye.
Grazie, grazie Presidente.
Thank you. I would also like to join the words of other colleagues thanking you. You've always been willing to come here to the Parliament and hold debates with us, and we're very grateful to you for your commitment. We'll take a short break now and then we'll resume.